Hello and welcome to the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program's Homeowner Webinar Series, a series given every third Tuesday of the month. My name is Jen Marvin and I'm the Florida Yards Neighborhood Statewide Coordinator. Today we have Dr. Chris Marble speaking with us about toxic plants. Your microphones have been muted. If you have questions, please type them into the chat box and we'll answer them at the end of the presentation. Please stick around until the end to take our exit survey. It should pop up at the end from your browser. It helps me give you the kind of programming you like and lets us know how we're doing. Our next presentation will be March 15th at 11 a.m. on pruning for the homeowner. I'd like to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Chris Marble is an associate professor in ornamental and landscape invasive weed management in the University of Florida's Environmental Horticulture Department and stationed at the Mid-Florida Research and Education Center. Dr. Marble's research and extension programs focus on developing effective and economical methods of weed control and mitigating negative environmental impacts from current weed management strategies in ornamental plant production and landscapes. It's my pleasure to hand the floor over to Dr. Chris Marble.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, everybody, for having me, and for everybody for tuning in today. So Jennifer gave you a little bit of background on myself. I'm primarily a weed specialist, and so you might be asking, how I got interested in toxic, or what I'm calling "quote unquote" wicked plants. Well, I guess several years ago, I started getting some calls from basically a lot of people that my wife works with, and then my wife, had always called me, but she's a veterinarian, and so they would be asking for identification of plants and things like that, where they suspected that pets got poisoned, or they ate some shrub or some cut flower that someone had. And so I just kind of got interested in it because those kept coming in more and more regularly, and I looked at a lot of the plant identification guides and the toxic plant guides and things like that that were available. And there wasn't a lot that was specific to Florida, or a lot of the plants that people might encounter here. So that led me to working with the FFL team and SMMO to develop a toxic plant app. And so through all that process, I got to know a lot of these plants and their toxicities and things like that. And that's what I'm going to share with you today. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a background, just some history in terms of how different toxic plants have been used throughout history, and some notable occurrences. And then we'll go into some of the more common ones that you might encounter in terms of identifying those, their toxic properties, and who they're toxic to. I'm definitely not going to be able to cover all the different plants that could potentially cause problems in terms of toxicity, or all the poisonous plants. I can't even really scratch the surface. But I'm going to give you a lot of different resources and things like that towards the end that you can take and you can use to get more information. I'll tell you a little bit about our toxic plant app that we have, and then I'll talk about a little bit of the other resources that we're trying to develop, like EDIS publication that we're working on, and then we'll be continually updating that toxic plant app as we have time and resources. So with that, we will go ahead and we will get started here. Let's see. There we go. So plants, they're among the top 10 substances that are implicated in poison exposures to humans. So just the Poison Control Center gets about 30 to 40 cases per year, and that's just that center. So that's not really including all the ones where people are just calling their primary physician and things like that. But there are a lot of poisonings or potential exposures and things like that that are caused by plants, or people ingesting plants that could potentially cause problems. There's about 15,000 calls related to companion animal poisoning, so mostly dogs and cats, and that's just the ASPCA that gets those. So there's a lot of other organizations that track those, and then the private veterinary practices and things like that. Well, they'll get a lot of calls with companion animals that are they eat some berry, or they're chewing on some plant, or et cetera, and it's causing nausea, and it requires treatment for those. So it is a pretty common occurrence. One of the big ways that plants can cause issues in terms of toxicity is for people that have livestock. So I have a colleague here at University of Florida, Dr. Brent Sellers, who's done a lot of work on that. And I'll show some of his resources that he developed with Jay Farrell. So if anyone does have livestock, horses, et cetera, some of those resources will be really good to have, because in a lot of cases, the toxic plants that we think of for livestock wouldn't be the ornamentals or cut flowers. There are a lot of weed species that you would see into pastures, and they can cause some significant problems. It's hard to really get good data in terms of the livestock poisonings that occur. Sometimes I think that, or a lot of the resources that I've read through, seems like some of those go unreported, or they're able to just treat them, in-house, and they don't get reported in any kind of database. But there are, I did see a couple of, verified peer-reviewed sources where there was over $100 million in losses, and that was in the 1960s in Texas alone. So a lot of these toxic plants can cause really big problems for livestock producers. And there's a long history of toxic plants, both verified, where we have pretty accurate records of those, and then also in folklore. And then some of just kind of the notable cases that you might be aware of or might have heard that are just kind of interesting to know. So Socrates, when he was sentenced to death for quote unquote poisoning the minds of the youth, they sentenced him to death by making him drink an elixir, or basically a drink made of poison hemlock. Nancy Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's mother, so she died from complications related to what they call milk sickness. And back in, several hundred years ago, that was relatively common. And it was when cows would eat some sort of toxic plant, and it would end up in the milk. And in this case, it was white snake root that the cows ate, and it could cause problems with the milk. So again, another one of those livestock issues. There's a lot of things, you read through different history books and look at different books and accounts, and a lot of people had used different plant poisons to create poison arrows. And then there was also this thing called ordeal poisons. And so these were often seeds or beans. And this was, 18th century and prior, but essentially what they would do is they would have some sort of seed or bean of a toxic plant. And then when someone was on trial, they would give them that, and they would be forced to eat that. And so in a lot of cases, they actually said that they would be proven to be quote unquote correct, because if someone was innocent and they knew they were innocent, but they believed in these ordeal poisons, and they believed that it could actually verify whether someone was innocent or guilty, they would quickly eat the poisonous plant part and swallow it, and then they would regurgitate that, and then they would be proven innocent because they lived through it. But if someone was guilty and they were fearing that they would be found guilty, they would slowly eat it, and so they were able to digest more of the poison, and then they would die. And so that's how they were sentenced, basically, or found to be guilty in those cases. But there's a lot of great books and things like that that are interesting to read if you're more interested in that. And there's also a lot of botanical gardens that might have a small section of the garden where they have different poisonous plants where you can go and look and read about all those. This is, I have on this slide here a picture of the gate. So this is the poison garden at a castle in Northumberland, United Kingdom. So that's like a world famous poisonous plant garden where everything in there is has some sort of toxic plant, or they have like things like the death flower and things like that in there that are interesting to see and read about. So these are just some of the cool examples that you can come across when you're doing some research into some of these toxic plants. So this is Acanthera species. So that's one of the species that was commonly used as a poison arrow plant. And so people would put basically make an extract of that plant and put them onto their arrows after they were shot into whatever prey that they were doing. That would act as a numbing agent and slow that down so that they could hunt more effectively. They would also use that to rub on plants like puncture vine and others that had thorns and use it to create traps. This is the African crested rat. And this rat actually has these modified hairs that will store some of these plant poisons on there. So that rat will hang around this poison arrow plant, and then I believe some other plants as well, but it stores the poisons on its hair. Doesn't affect the rat, but it makes it to where the other animals will not feed on those African crested rats. So just kind of an interesting aside. Here's Eastern black walnut. So this is a plant. If you grew up in the Eastern US, you probably have seen these grow in wild, used as a landscape plant too, native plant. But the walnuts on the Eastern black walnut have contain a substance called juglans, and so people can use those. They'll crunch up those berries, and they used to use them as a fish poison. So they would put those into some sort of burlap sack and sink that in the water, and then the fish would come up. That's illegal to use and definitely not recommended, but people would use that back in the day, and they'll actually use that too and make a crush those nuts up and get the water and pour that on the ground, and the night crawlers will rise to the surface because that juglin irritates them, and they'll use those as fish bait. So there's just a bunch of different ways that these different plant toxins have been used throughout history. Then also in pop culture too. So this is just a scene from the show Breaking Bad, actually. But this is lily of the valley. So this is a common native plant in the southwestern United States, and it was prominently shown and had a big storyline in that show as being a source of a poison in that show. There's a lot of common poisonous plant families. So a lot of these I'll show some examples of today. So the Solanaceae, that's stuff like potatoes, peppers, tomatoes, so stuff that we commonly eat. But it also has things like the nightshades, like the American black nightshade that's toxic, and horse nettle and things like that in there. The Anacardaceae, or the cashew family, things like mangoes, cashews that we eat, but it also has things like Brazilian pepper. Then also things like poison ivy, oak, sumac, etc. Those are all in the same family. Some people can be toxic or be allergic to mangoes, and that's because of that. And like cashews, you don't ever eat a raw cashew, or even the ones that are quote unquote raw, they were probably steamed in some way, because the shells of cashews can be an irritant. The nettles, the Urticaceae, of the nettle family, those are the stinging and other nettles. A lot of things in the Euphorbiaceae, or the spurge family, can be somewhat toxic, probably less so than some of the other ones that I have on the list here. The carrot family, it's got a lot of herbs and vegetables that we commonly eat, but it also has things like water hemlock, poison hemlock, giant hogweed, and those are potentially very deadly plants. And then also another one that you'll often see as being toxic to pets, and then livestock, and then even if they're not prepared properly to people, but is the Fabaceae, or the bean family. So all of your beans, but then things like rattlebox, hemp sesbania, creeping indigo, some of those are real common plants that you see show up in these lists of plants that are toxic to livestock. So there's a lot of different ways that plants can be quote unquote dangerous or cause problems. So, a lot of what we're going to be talking about today are the ones that are going to be poisonous if they're ingested, or you have, contact with them with your skin. A lot of these can cause dermatitis and things like that. But then, a major way that's the focus of one of the focuses of my problems is the destruction that they can cause, the habitat destruction. So a lot of our non-native invasive plants, they can cause tremendous problems in natural areas and landscapes, and really take over. They don't have those natural predators. So you can see in the picture here, this is kudzu that has just completely taken over this area of the forest. And we once thought that kudzu was a great, soil stabilizer and prevented soil erosion. People would use that as livestock feed, and it was actually promoted by a lot of different organizations in the past. But we quickly realized that it is a very destructive invasive plant. And if you live anywhere in Florida, it's easy to drive down the interstate or even look outside and see some of the invasive plants and a lot of the problems that they cause, throughout Florida. So there's also a lot of them that they're not really considered toxic, but they could be painful or cause injuries. Personally, the plant that causes me probably the more injuries than anything else are sandburrs. Just because a lot of my research plots, we get those we get those all over the place, and they'll get on your socks. And if you have cats or pets or anything like that, that's a terrible one to have around. They can be parasites. They can, of course, be allergens. A funny thing with the allergens, about 4 years ago or so, 4 or 5 years ago, I went and got my allergy test done, a skin prick test. Every plant that they tested me for and every pet dander that they tested me for, I was on the highly allergic side too. And they said, well, we hope that you don't work with plants for a living or have any pets. And I said, well, I'm a horticulturist and a weed scientist, and my wife's a veterinarian. So I picked the worst possible profession to probably go into. And then I guess, as far as my wife's profession, as many pets as we have, I probably didn't do a very a very good job there in terms of exposing myself to allergens, but they can cause a lot of problems too. There's also some that can be considered quote unquote arsonists. So things like the gas plant, which creates a plant oil as a response to drought stress that can ignite, and it's highly flammable. Then things like eucalyptus, pampas grass, kogan grass. Some of these invasive plants, they burn really hot and they're easily flammable, and they can burn hotter than the surrounding areas, and it makes it easier for them to come back into those areas following these burns than it does some of the native plants. So this is like an example of a kogan grass infestation. You can see this pretty commonly in Florida, and all this grass will brown out in the winter. And I'm definitely not a fire specialist, but I talked to a lot of fire specialists that do control burns as a part of sound forestry management, and they'll say that kogan grass can cause some problems because it ignites and burns very hot. Those fires are very hot, and then following that fire, the kogan grass can resprout, whereas some of those native plants can't come back in and reestablish in those areas as quickly as the kogan grass, and so it can make those situations worse in those cases. And the kogan grass can continue to spread and take up a larger and larger area following some of those burns. So another thing to be mindful of is that almost any plant could potentially be toxic or cause problems, and this is one of the things that we ran into when we were trying to create the poisonous plant app, is that you look at all these potential plants or things that we think of as food that could cause problems, and it's really individualistic in terms of when it could be causing issues. So like peanuts and strawberries, there's probably more issues with people being allergic to those and causing problems than a lot of the plants that I have on this list, just because of how common they are. And people can have severe allergic reactions and go into anaphylaxis by being exposed to those. Also things like cashews. So there's a wide range of sensitivity to these. A lot of these are dose dependent. We always say that the dose makes the poison. There's a lot of important and common plants that are toxic to people, pets, and livestock, and those are the ones that we're going to talk about. But then a couple of disclaimers. So I'm not a medical doctor or a veterinarian. If you do, you think you've encountered one of these plants or been exposed to it in some way, or your pet or whatever, call those medical professionals. Please don't call me, because I can help you identify it and know about the plant, but I have no medical training whatsoever. So just a disclaimer there. Some of these toxic plants are very familiar to us, and y'all probably are very aware of things like poison ivy or poison sumac, but then some of them are also just common landscape plants or house plants that you might not be familiar of. And then also weed species. So a lot of weed species that we think of as quote unquote weeds are just plants that pop up that are uncultivated. Those can be toxic as well, and you typically won't find those and toxic plant lists and things. And so I try to highlight some of those so that people are aware of those as well. So those are the first group that I'm to talk about are the toxic invasive plants, and then the quote unquote weeds. So I say weeds, a lot of these that I'll talk about on this list are native plants and they provide benefits, but they're just by weeds, I'm saying plants that are popping up and you're not cultivating them or planting them, yourself. So that's kind of my definition for that. The first one we'll talk about is rosary pea. So this is a very invasive plant in Florida. It's a category 1. So that means that it's displacing natives, it's expanding in its range, and it's causing a lot of problems. This is extremely toxic plant. So you can see there in terms of the percentage of abrin, which is the toxic in this plant, per weight is fatal. And so a single seed of this could be fatal in some instances. Birds are seemingly unaffected, and they can eat the seeds of this and continue to spread it. And that's one of the ways that this weed has become more invasive and spread through other areas. And this is one that we typically see mostly in Central and South Florida because it can be sensitive to cold weather. But that's one to be aware of. In terms of identification, you've got the highly, or these compound leaflets, and then these berries here. I'm not going to go too deep on the identification of all these. I would tell people a great resource on identification of especially all the invasive plants, and then even some of the native plants as well, is the Center for Aquatic and Invasive Plants at the University of Florida. They have plant identification cards, for a lot of these, and that's a great resource to have. The next one is castor bean. So ricin, ricin is a very potent toxin, and that is in Ricinus communis, which is the castor bean. So this is an escaped in Florida. It was brought over as partially as an ornamental, and then also for oil production. But it's a large non-woody plant. It does have a lot of ornamental uses, so that's typically how it was used in the past. But the seeds are very deadly. They contain ricin, and that's a very potent toxin. They have spiny seed capsules, and it's also used as a source of seed oil, like the castor oil that people might use. That's processed to remove the ricin from that, but it comes from the same plant, or at least partially from the same plant. This is a common one to look out for, and this is one that's probably one of the more common ones that I see around Central Florida is the chinaberry. And this goes up, far up as north as Alabama and more north, really a lot of different areas in the southeast. But this is the category 2 invasive in Florida. This is a small tree. It was once, used very widely as an ornamental. Because it does have really showy flowers and berries, and it's kind of a good looking tree. A lot of times you see these after hurricanes and they'll roll over and topple because they're not very strong trees. They're small and they tend to break in our hurricanes and things. But it's very toxic to pets and children especially. The berries are the most toxic part, and that's also the part that's probably more commonly eaten by pets, and especially dogs. So I've seen a lot of cases where, or heard of a lot of cases where dogs have been poisoned by eating those berries. And this is an invasive plant, so it's not one that should really be used in the landscape at all. They're most toxic when they're ripe, but they can be toxic, at any time. So that is a tree that should be removed. This is a native tree that can be, a really good small tree as an ornamental plant, and it's a native. This is the Florida soapberry, Sapodinus, but it's also has poisonous seeds as well. So it's kind of a look-alike, but they both can be toxic. But if you wanted a tree that looks similar to the Chinaberry in terms of ornamental appeal, this will be a good alternative. Although those berries are toxic as well. So Jimson weed. So this is a common weed that you see scattered throughout Florida, not really as common as some of the other plants on this list. You see it up a lot in the Panhandle, and I have a distribution map up here on this slide. But it's a native, it's a summer annual. It's also called Jamestown weed in some circles because Jamestown settlers, they encountered it, and a lot of them were sickened and died by eating Jimson weed. And then also those same settlers, they remembered that this was a toxic plant, and they used it as or there's reports that it was used as a poison during the American Revolution for British soldiers. So just kind of an interesting story there. All parts of the plant are poisonous, and it can be fatal if large enough quantities are eaten of that. And then Brazilian pepper. So this is probably the worst invasive tree in Florida, a Category 1 invasive. It's in the Anacardiaceae family. It's one of those plant crime families. But the biggest issue with it is it causes dermatitis and respiratory problems if it's being burned. But some people can be more sensitive to it than others. But in terms of dermatitis, it can cause symptoms similar to poison ivy in some individuals, but it's usually not as toxic as something like poison ivy or poison oak. In Florida right now, there's over 700,000 acres that are infested with Brazilian pepper. And so I say this probably more sinister as an invasive than it is really as a toxic plant. But there's really, as far as in Florida, there's nothing really to like about the Brazilian pepper. Poison sumac. So this is another native plant, really native to the whole eastern U.S., really found commonly throughout the Panhandle. When I lived in Alabama, you'd see this in the woods all the time, not as common down here in Florida, but causes severe dermatitis. So probably a lot worse than poison ivy or poison oak, at least in my experience. But it was famously, it was a boy, Frederick Law Olmsted, had heavy sumac poisoning when he was about 14 years old, broke out, and it caused permanent eye damage, kept his eyes shut, and he was out of school for a year. But he said that when he was out of school for a year, it allowed him to roam the countryside and daydream, and took an interest in architecture and gardening and things. And he became a very famous author, and he designed Central Park in New York City. He was a famous landscape architect, but he attributed a lot of his success to that time that he had to spend away and kind of gather his thoughts and develop his interest from when he was encountered the poison sumac. Creeping indigo is another one. So this is a real common issue for livestock, and it's a common weed in landscapes and turf grass, etc. But it's another one in the bean family. But it's very toxic to livestock. It causes high heartbeat and respiratory rates, can cause foaming at the mouth. The animals, horses and cows especially, can be sensitive to light, and they can get ulcers. There's a good IFAS article on identifying creeping indigo, and then also how to manage it if it is in the pasture and you do have livestock that you want to protect from that. And then the nightshades is another group. So these are native to Florida. They're summer annuals. A lot of the nightshades of the plants in the Solanaceae family are toxic. The green fruit is especially poisonous. It's the same toxin, solanine, that's in green potatoes, but it has caused deaths in the past. Really, the issue is the berries, when they're ripe, they turn this real nice dark purple to blackish color, and children and pets and things like that might tend to want to eat those. But it's a very common weed in landscapes, and I see it pop up, in my yard all the time. Pokeweed, so Phytolacca americana. So this is a common one. This is another native to Florida, but it's a herbaceous perennial. Usually you'll see it where it's relatively small, maybe a couple feet tall, but it can get up to 10 feet tall, but usually it's a lot shorter. But you have these real distinct purple stems, and then this fruit that starts out green and then turns to this dark berry color. And that can, stain your skin or your clothes and things like that if those berries were to burst on you. The young plants, they can be eaten if they're prepared properly. It's probably not a great idea. Growing up in Alabama, my grandmother used to make what they call poke salad. So it's basically you're boiling this and dumping the water off multiple times. And they did it just kind of as a remembrance. A lot of people in the South, especially if you grew up in real rural areas and didn't have a lot of money, this was a way that you could eat this poke salad. And it's kind of like boiled, maybe boiled okra in terms of the texture and things. But it was popularized by Tony Joe White in the Poke Salad Annie song. So you probably heard that, but that's the plant that the song is talking about. And then lantana species. So these are toxic, primarily an issue with livestock, but common invasive, the lantana camara. We have native lantana species, and a lot of the lantana that you buy, for sale from nurseries are sterile varieties of that. But the lantana strigmocara, I think, is the full name of the invasive variety, and those are highly invasive, and they can be really toxic to livestock. All of the wild onion, garlic, etc. Those are common turf weeds. You see them in landscapes, but then even the onion and garlic that you buy at the store, these are primarily an issue for dogs. So dogs are very sensitive to onion and garlic, and they can be toxic to them. So now we'll go into some ornamentals and house plants that are common and kind of go through some of these. So there's a lot of different genus of plants that are called lilies. So hemerocallis will be like the daylilies, and then lilium or like different lilies. But anything that really has lily as the common name, or most of the stuff that has lily as the common name, are toxic, and especially toxic to cats. So like Easter lilies, for example, these are commonly used in cut flower arrangements and things. It's my wife's favorite flower, but we can't, we don't keep Easter lilies in the house, at least that are accessible to our cats, because we have one cat that's crazy and will always go and try to eat, whatever plants that are in there. But really good cut flowers, but they can be toxic to cats, and all these different lilies, daylily, spider lily, calla lily. Those are toxic, and primarily the issue is with cats who might chew on the leaves, and typically all parts of those plants are poisonous. Peace lily, which is like the spath lily or spathiphyllum. So that's one of the most common sources of plant poisonings. And it's not that it's all that highly toxic, but they're very commonly used as house plants really throughout the U.S. and in other parts of the world. It's a great, easy to care for house plant. And so that's probably why it was one of the most common sources of plant poisonings, not just because of the toxicity, but because of how commonly it is used, and little kids might go and pick up the leaf and start chewing it, or you have pets that are, chewing on the leaves and things like that. And it's mostly toxic to cats, but it could cause issues in dogs or children as well. Just anything that might eat, a lot of the leaf tissue, or at least chew on it. And mostly the issues with skin irritation, burning of the mouth, and then if it's ingested, a lot of nausea and stuff as well. But typically it's not, it is something that's treatable. It's not something like rosary pea, which in a lot of cases can be fatal. Dung cane or Dieffenbachia, That's another really common house plant that's toxic. You might see them in the landscape as you get down further south into South Florida, but it's toxic to people and pets. It causes severe irritation of the mouth and throat, if it's ingested. Dumb cane is the name because it'll cause some numbing of the mouth and the tongue where you can't talk. And so that's where the dumb cane name comes from. The biggest issue is the dermatitis, and you get that, in your mouth and things. It was once used as an arrow poison, in the past because of the numbing effect that it can have. Pothos, so real common house plant. You see these all the time. It's a great house or interior plant to have. Gorgeous plants and easy to care for, so they're great options. But people will take that and they'll put it outside, and it will not behave once it goes outside, especially if it's in Central and South Florida. It becomes invasive. You see it like you have in this photo here, where it's climbing up trees. And it's actually a very hard plant to kill once it gets large and established like this, but it'll kind of go wild once you take it outside and let it grow. Not a great option to plant outside, but it is a good interior plant. But it does cause a range of symptoms. It's kind of similar to Dieffenbachia, where it's causing burning of the mouth and throat if it's chewed on by children or pets in that case. And then sago palm. So these aren't palms, of course, they're cycads, but they're all parts of this plant are poisonous. And oftentimes, if you see these for sale at Home Depot or Lowe's or other garden centers, they'll have warning labels on it that it is a toxic plant. Again, not a reason to avoid using that in the landscape. It can be a good landscape plant, but it is something to be aware of because it is toxic. All parts are highly poisonous, but the fruit or the nuts on the female plants, I have that up here at the top, a female and then a male, as they're dioecious. But the nuts are usually the part that causes poisonings, and mostly in dogs. And that's just because that's the part that's the easiest to ingest. So it's, if you've ever dealt with a lot of the cycads, it will be pretty difficult to chew on and eat a lot of the leaf tissue or the bark or anything like that. But those nuts will fall off, and those can be easily ingested, and it's very toxic to to people and pets, but dogs are where we see the most poisonings there. But coonties and other cycads can also be toxic as well if they're consumed. This is a famously toxic plant. So the nerium oleander, or the oleander. So a very common landscape ornamental used throughout Florida. Great, gorgeous looking ornamental, easy to care for. It only gets a few pests like the oleander caterpillar and things like that. But other than that, it's a really showy, big, nice shrub or small tree. But it is extremely toxic. It used to be thought of, there's reports and old books and journals and things where people would try this, and it was reported to be an anti-venom when someone was bitten by a snake. But then oftentimes, if they were given some sort of elixir made of oleander, that would cause more damage than the actual snake bite. But there's a lot of legends and stories and reports. I have a couple of poisonous plant books, and there were stories in there. Don't know really how verifiable they are, but of campers dying or being severely sick after eating food that was cooked on fires made of the wood. The fire can be toxic if this plant is burned, kind of similar to Brazilian pepper. The honey that's made from nectar of bees that are feeding on this plant can cause issues as well. But it's been used in several cases. There are reports of people using it as to attempt murder by poisoning people with oleander, because it is a very well-known toxic plant. Duranta is one that you don't really hear about that much in terms of being a toxic plant, but it can be. It's a common landscape shrub and border plant, and you see this all around Central and South Florida. A lot of different cultivars are available. You see it mostly as this golden dewdrop, these shorter, smaller varieties. but it's highly toxic if it's consumed. And then if it's one of the fruiting varieties, that's where the toxin is the most concentrated, is in the fruit. Brugmansia, or angel's trumpet. This is another very toxic plant. You typically will see these as large shrubs or small trees, like you see in this photo here. Very showy flower, so it's kind of one of those knocked down, gorgeous landscape plants. But it is very poisonous, so all parts are potentially poisonous. The seeds are the most toxic part, but the other parts of the plant can be poisonous as well if they're ingested. But the symptoms are really scary looking at the Brugmansia, but it'll cause, people will become delirious, go into convulsions, have a rapid heartbeat. And the children and pets, again, like everything on this list, they're going to be the most vulnerable to that, just because of the size, and then also because they're going to be more prone to ingesting a lot of these different things. So some other common toxic ornamentals, so irises, those are toxic primarily to cats. Caladiums, with caladiums, really it's the bulbs that are toxic, and you don't really, that's not really a common one that you hear about being toxic. But if you had dogs that like to dig, and they dig up the bulb and they eat some of that, that can be potentially a serious toxin. Loquat, so I have a couple of loquats at my house, and I enjoy the berries there, but the seeds inside, they have, I believe it's cyanide, like a lot of seeds do. I could be wrong about that, but the seeds inside those the fruit are toxic if they're especially if they're chewed up and swallowed. So that's one to be wary of. But other things like tea plant, so all parts of it are toxic, potentially toxic. Nandina, primarily the berries, and then Carolina jessamine, so a good native plant, but a lot of the parts of it can be toxic as well, all to various different degrees, in terms of the amount of toxin that would really be required to cause significant problems. So here's some more resources to do some more information for yourself, and just some good things to be aware of, like in terms of identifying some of the ones that we talked about, and then other plants that could potentially be toxic, and some good resources to look through. So this is a good book, Handbook of Poisonous and Injurious Plants. This is kind of a more of a curiosity thing. So this would be like a good identification guide and give you more information on the plants. This is just kind of an interesting book where a lot of the stories that I went over today, those are actually included in this book as well. But it's called Wicked Plants, and in the book, this is a book by Amy Stewart, who's a garden writer, but she has a lot of different examples of different toxic plants, and then plants that cause destruction and things like that. And it's a real interesting and fun read. And then Toxic Plants of North America. So this is another textbook type book that's very detailed and informative in terms of identification. The University of Florida Veterinary Medicine website has a good link here for more information on toxic plants. The Poisonous Plants of Pastures, I talked about that a little bit, but that's available in the IFAS bookstore, I believe. But these are some other good books to check out and to look into. And I think all of these are available on Amazon and a lot of the other online book retailers. And then we have the Florida Toxic Plant app as well. This, we've got about 200 or so plant species and 600 different color photos. And what we tried to do was give people, ways to identify and know these plants based upon the different growth stages. So a lot of the different toxic plant lists and things that you'll look at, it's just a single picture of the plant when it's fully maturing and flowering, etc. But if someone doesn't know a lot about plants, those can be hard to use in terms of identification and knowing, what plant it is that you're really using, or that you're trying to identify, and what can be toxic about it. But For this particular app, we try to take pictures throughout, its life cycle. We try to include a lot of weeds and invasive plants that people would encounter. And then we also tried to make it very specific to plants that people in Florida would encounter as well. So you're not looking through, toxic plant apps and seeing things like foxglove and some of these other peonies, things like that you wouldn't really see outside of a cut flower arrangement or something like that. So that's available on the Florida Friendly Landscaping website, and it's a web-based app. But that's a good resource too to have, and I hope to update that, and then also to have a EDIS publication that goes with it as well that people can use to help you to learn more about different toxic plants. So some final thoughts. So a lot of common plants can potentially be dangerous if they're eaten or they're not prepared properly. But I have a lot of plants in here that I talk about them being toxic, and it's not saying that I don't recommend them being used in a landscape or anything like that. You just gotta, it goes back to right plant, right place. So if you have a lot of children that are running around, yeah, it's probably not a good idea to have a bunch of oleanders where they can go out and readily put that into their mouth or anything like that. But there's still a place for all these different plants, and a lot of these are natives that can create a lot of other benefits, just instead of just their ornamental appeal. But it doesn't really necessarily mean that they should be removed or used, but I try to give people that information so they can make those decisions based upon their particular situation with, especially if you have small children or pets and things like that. But it just depends upon the situation. Also, probably not a good idea to go foraging, unless you are an expert, because some of these plants can look real similar to other things, and it can be difficult to identify and really break down the different species and things. A lot of the symptoms are very similar if you look in those lists. So nausea, burning of the skin or the mouth and things like that. So those are things to be aware of. And then again, don't call me if you're poison, call a medical professional, poison control, veterinarian, etc. And try to identify or know what plant it was that you were exposed to, or your pet was exposed to, etc. There's a lot of good plant identification apps that are out there as well that can be used. So if you go to the Mid-Florida Research and Education Center website, we have some guides on how to use those plant apps to get better identification out of using those. So things like Plant Snap, PlantNet, iNaturalist, etc. But those have come a long way in the past 5 years or so, and those can be useful in terms of identifying plants that you might not be that familiar with, but you've got to know how to take a good picture of those, and we try to give some guidelines on that. But you can just go to the Mid-Florida REC website, and you can download that guide. It's just a PDF guide to show you how to use 4 common plant identification apps. But that is all that I have for the presentation. Thank you very much for your time. I hope you enjoyed it. That's my email if you'd like any more information on any of this. And I believe this is going to be recorded, so you'd have access to all of those resources and the different links and stuff like that in there. But with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions that anyone might have, or try to answer any questions anyone might have.
We had just a couple of questions. Does rosary pea have allelopathic effects on nearby plants?
Yeah, so allelopathy is a very common plant defense mechanism. And a lot of plants do have a lot of the plants on this list do have very strong allelopathic properties. I believe rosary pea is one that does. I'm not for sure on that. I think it does. A lot of the invasive plants do have some sort of allelopathic property that they'll exude either in their leaf debris or in their roots, which will limit competition from surrounding plants. That black walnut that I showed before, as a quote unquote fish poison. So it's a very strong allelopathic tree, kind of a poster child for at least in the eastern U.S. as being an allelopathic tree, and people would take extracts from that and use that to actually as a natural herbicide in some cases, because it has such strong allelopathic properties. I believe rosary pea does as well, but just not off the top of my head. I don't know what compound that would be, or if it's for sure been verified in rosary pea or not. But a lot of those plants do have allelopathic properties.
Okay. One person wanted to know if her dog eating stokesia leaves was a problem.
I don't know on stokesia. I'd say so there's a lot of, I mean, if you're not for sure, it's always, best to try to have them avoid eating those different things. I don't know if stokesia is an issue or not. I don't remember seeing it, on any of the poisonous plant lists that I pulled up. But I guess anything could potentially cause problems if they ate, a lot of it. Just like if you eat a lot of raw vegetables, even if it's, an edible vegetable, people can get upset stomach and nausea and things like that from that, depending upon the person. But I'm not sure. I'd say to check some of those, there's a lot of pet specific resources out there that would give more information on that.
Okay. Where did you say we can locate the ID apps info?
So if you go to the Mid-Florida Research and Education Center website, you can just Google IFAS Mid-Florida Research and Education Center, and then navigate to the weed information page, which is my page. It'll be on there, and it's called the plant. I think it's like something like identification app guide or something like that. But it's fairly easy to navigate to. It's not a real complicated website, and it's organized pretty easy to get through. So
okay. Are green tomatoes poisonous if you don't cook them?
Best way is so I mean, I'm from Alabama, so I don't know anything about green tomatoes unless they're deep fried. So that's the only way that I know to eat green tomatoes. But yeah, so I don't think there's any issue. I mean, I've eaten a green tomato that's raw before. Some people can have sensitivity to a lot of plants in the Solanaceae family, which tomatoes would fall into that. But I'm not, an expert on that, and so I wouldn't really be the person to ask.
Okay. Are the leaves of Ilex falmatoria poisonous to livestock?
I don't know about livestock, and I think it's one of those that's not that highly toxic. It's you'd have to eat, a lot to cause significant problems. It's not something like lantana or some of the more poisonous ones that I listed. Yeah, there's I think that it might, or you can look at the that toxic livestock guide that I showed. And it's got more information. I'm not sure if that one's included in there or not, but it's not one that I usually see as being one that's highly toxic to livestock. So,
okay. Are the Kalanchoe varieties toxic?
Kalanchoe?
Kalanchoe, I think, is how Kalanchoe.
Oh, yeah. I think those are. I think I remember seeing those, and we might have one of those in the toxic plant list. But I think I've seen some of those on different toxic plant guides, but don't know off the top of my head.
Okay. Let's see. That might be it for questions. I did get a question if this is available recorded. We are recording this. It will be available on the Florida Friendly Landscaping homepage under resources and then under webinars, probably within the next 2 weeks. Here somebody said, did I pronounce that wrong? Kalanchoe?
Yeah, Kalanchoe. Yeah, somebody said that they were toxic for sure. So that's what I believe as well. I think I remember seeing them on several toxic plant lists.
Okay. Well, that's all we have for today. Thank you so much, Dr. Marble. We really appreciate you coming and sharing your knowledge on toxic plants. It was a really great talk, and there are a number of messages that say people loved it. So thank you very much for coming and doing this today.
Absolutely. Thank y'all again for having me and for everybody for tuning in. So I enjoyed it.
Okay, great. Thank you. Have a good day.
You too.